right. Well, as people kind of start floating in, I'll go ahead and get going since we're at 5 so that we can be mindful of everyone's time. So first of all, I'll just allow you to introduce yourself, who you are, who you're with, and what you do.
Oh, sure. Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me, Lauren. My name is Abe Bonowitz. I'm the executive director and co-founder of Death Penalty Action. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and basically our focus is lifting up opposition to executions wherever they're happening in the United States. You know, we'll talk about stuff that's happening in other countries when it makes sense. But for example, we did a podcast with some folks from Iran last week, where there have been, we think, at least 800 executions this year. So it's a whole different kind of world there. But there's a lot of similarities in terms of, you know, what the individuals who are facing that are going through. So we had a conversation about that and simply wanted to be in solidarity with them. And today being Tuesday, I'll mention that they have something they call Tuesdays against the death penalty, and that is set and taking place. Actually, it's a fast for them in more than 42 prisons in Iran. Prisoners are leading this, and they're fasting on Tuesdays, every Tuesday, because Monday is the day they come to get you and take you to death watch, and Wednesday is the day they kill you. And they just began doing this kind of protest. It's the kind of thing that people can engage with. You know, it's just kind of like our annual fast and vigil that we do on the sidewalk in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. So in any case, we're focused on judicial executions in the United States, and our mission is to, you know, ultimately abolish the death penalty, but through activism, education, and engaging people, we make sure that there are ways for people to oppose every execution, and where there's opportunity to also engage in abolishing, legislatively or otherwise, abolishing the death penalty, stopping executions, making sure that executions can't happen anymore. And we've been successful as part of a broader movement in making it so that there's 23 states that don't have a death penalty and don't execute. And we want to just keep growing that number.
Absolutely. And what got you first involved in this type of work?
Well, it's interesting. I found myself actually at a meeting of a group called Amnesty International, which is an international human rights organization that focuses on, especially at that time, on preventing torture and well, put it this way, they were working to free prisoners of conscience, which are people who are in prison for their beliefs, religion, language, skin color, ethnic origin, sex or sexual orientation, who have not used or advocated violence, people in prison for their identity. And I was interested in that. And that's what the part that I paid attention to when I got the opportunity to go to a meeting. So I was surprised at that meeting when I found that they were talking about getting rid of the death penalty. And the speaker was a capital defense attorney who represents people facing execution. Well, I argued with her. I said an eye for an eye, and this is the United States. We have the best justice system in the world. Of course, I knew nothing about it really at that point, but I set out to try to prove those people wrong. And in trying to prove them wrong, I found out that everything I believed about the death penalty, the truth was the opposite. And I therefore had to change my mind. And the thing that made me change my mind was learning that you have to kill in a county that can afford a death penalty trial. It's that simple. Kill in a rural county, they don't have the budget for a death penalty trial. That's where the high cost of the death penalty is weighted, upfront at the trial level, right at the beginning. So as soon as they decide that your crime is punishable by death, and they're going to seek a death penalty, they're deciding to spend at least twice as much money just on the trial. And that's a roll of the dice, because you have to get a conviction and a death sentence, and they don't always get that. So for me, it was learning that what matters more is the geography of county lines and the budget of an elected prosecutor, and the wherewithal of an elected prosecutor to decide whether he or she is going to seek a death sentence. those things matter more than the severity of the crime. And that's what made me change my mind initially, jumping
Mhm.
from one side of the fence to the other. I still said if we could make it fair and equal, then okay. And then I came to understand what I call the collateral damage of the death penalty, how it impacts the people far beyond the victim and the killer or alleged killer, to their families and people involved in the court system and law enforcement and broader community. And it was coming to understand the collateral damage and how the death penalty creates more victims. That's what made me change my heart. And like I said, the facts changed my head, and the journey that I've been on changed my heart and made me oppose the death penalty in all cases, which is not a capitulation to the idea that people should get away with murder. Absolutely not. I believe in accountability. Our organization believes in accountability. We're not always, we will not concede that death by incarceration is always the answer. However, it is the alternative right now. In pretty much any state that has the death penalty, you're either going to get a death by execution or death by incarceration. And, until we get to a place where society is ready to give that up too, which I don't see happening anytime real soon, then at least we know that we shouldn't be killing people, and we have a way to be safe from people who've done awful crimes and hold them accountable without executions. And we know that because that's what we use in the vast majority of cases. So, and now that's a lot more than you asked for, but that's the essence of how I came to oppose the death penalty and what we consider as an alternative.
Yeah, I think that the death penalty is a little unique in that everyone who I know who opposes a death penalty sort of comes at it from different angles, and we're convinced of the argument because of different reasons. Some people because there's, obviously the racism aspect that's inherent with the death penalty, or or poverty and that sort of thing. Sometimes it's literally like the libertarians who are just like, you know what, it's cheaper to keep you alive forever than to spend money, or I don't trust the
Yeah.
government to enact these things. So it's interesting that if you have, a group of 5 people who all oppose the death penalty, they might do so for different reasons and, but feel very convicted about it. So it's interesting hearing you talk about it coming from both the head and the heart. And so I think it's very relatable.
Well, that's actually an important thing to understand too. And I have learned by making a lot of mistakes that, when you get engaged with somebody, so I'm always wearing a button like this, this one says "Stop Executions Now," or a T-shirt with a message like that. So, and sometimes you forget that you're wearing something in the store or whatever, and somebody says, "Hey, I like your button," or challenges you on it. And then you have to remember, and the key thing that I have learned the hard way too many times is what's most important is to remember that you don't know where another person is coming from. You don't want to talk about what Jesus says to somebody who's concerned about the money. And you don't want to talk about the money to somebody who wants to know or thinks, what their Bible teaches them, So it's most important for me, my point of view is my experience is find out where somebody's at first, and then you can begin, if you need to plant seeds of doubt on the issues that matter to them. And this is true not just with the death penalty, but anything that any of these social issues that we have to engage people on in doing a consistently pro-life ethic piece of the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is different for everyone on a lot of these issues. People have different places where they're coming from and places where they're persuadable versus some things that are just going to automatically shut down. And so I think, yeah, listening to people and understanding them first before going into whatever you're trying to persuade them is very important. So I know, obviously, the name of the organization, Death Penalty Action, but what does that action look like? What are some of your activities that you're doing? What is your, let's say, normal week? Because I'm sure your normal day is a little different day to day, but what does that look like for you?
Every day and every week are a little bit different. And that's one of the reasons why I I am grateful to be in this work because I don't know what I don't know what most days are going to bring. Um, of course, as the executive director uh, and a leader in a small nonprofit, every day does have its elements, like checking to see, did we get any unexpected nice donations that help us stay alive, and how do we continue to find people that want to support the work. That's a big chunk of my effort, on top of and in addition to just making sure that the work is getting done to lift up the visibility. So just for example, today, just first day after a long weekend, checking out on things like that, but also following up on the connections that I made in meetings over the long weekend. But then really it's what's the next execution, and so we have a petition that anybody can come to the webpage and sign. And of course, that goes out in all of our social media channels. And then when you sign a petition, there's an invitation that you should receive right afterwards by email to also follow up with a phone call to the governor or the parole board, whatever the target is at the moment. And then, and maybe that's as much as we get, making sure those things are happening. But if we come to a point of like an execution day, as we had last week on Thursday, then we're involved in making sure that the petitions are delivered. Sometimes we'll do them early in the week. Sometimes we'll do them the day of. Sometimes we'll do both. But we'll connect with people that are on the ground in the state capitol of the state where the execution is happening, and make sure that they have the petitions and the signatures, and we'll carry them into the governor's office. And sometimes we do media around that. Sometimes we just get them in and deliver them. Additionally, it's driving phone calls. We have what we call our virtual sit-ins. So we try to just jam up the phone lines of a governor's office, especially the day of and the day before an execution. So it's driving that stuff both through emails to people on our list and social media, and when we can, being in person to get that going. Then there's organizing, and so I've been doing a lot of that recently in Utah, for example, where we were expecting this Thursday night to have a firing squad execution. And that execution has been put on hold because the men they were going to kill, Ralph Menzies, who was on death row for killing Maureen Hunsaker like 39 years ago. He has dementia, and the courts were looking at his mental capacity from evaluations a year ago, and his lawyers were saying, he's progressed. And anybody that's ever dealt with a friend or a relative who's been on that path of dementia or Alzheimer's, anything like that, knows that you can shift and get to a point where you have no idea what's happening, or you can't remember what just happened 30 seconds ago. I experienced that with my dad, who had Alzheimer's for about 10 years. Incidentally, today is the anniversary of his death, so I'll be lighting a candle for him in a little while. And in any case, so in Utah, where they don't have very many executions, they're infrequent, and we have this situation. We're following what the lawyers are doing. We're not the lawyers. The lawyers are the ones who can work in courts. Courts are supposed to be immune from public pressure. So our focus is on the policymakers, who can make that decision to halt the execution, who can make the decision to change the law. And that's where we put our attention. So I've been out working with folks on the ground in Utah, because they don't have a functioning state organization. We've sort of created one, Utahns Against the Death Penalty. And we're just looking at different ways to make sure that the public is hearing our message, and we're getting that message as broadly disseminated as we can, and finding leaders who will engage their own communities, so clergy and business leaders and any kind of people that have a community, and asking them to do stuff, and asking them to, we have a sign-on letter for leadership in the community that we'll be delivering to the governor's office when when the time comes. And in addition to that, we also were planning for a press conference this Thursday morning and a petition delivery, as we do in every state. And then that execution is at midnight. It's supposed to be at midnight or 12 a.m. on the 5th, which means the night of the 4th. So we also were planning a protest, a prayerful protest vigil that would take place outside the prison at in Utah. They create a free speech zone. It's actually about 2 miles from the prison. Last year, we sued them to try to make sure that we were right adjacent to the front gate, but that lawsuit was thrown out. So, we did our best with that. In any case, one of the exciting things that we did this time is well, let me back up to say that we found opportunity for education in the question of the firing squad, because that's how the Utah execution, this particular one, was going to be carried out. Well, it turns out that the last time they did a firing squad execution in Utah, the members of the firing squad, expert shooters, one would think, all missed the center target. They all shot off center. And you can find a video about this on our webpage at deathpenaltyaction.org, or also at Utahns Against the Death Penalty, UADP.org. Because not just there, but the last firing squad execution in South Carolina earlier this year. So that Utah one, the last firing squad execution was in 2010. But in South Carolina, it was this year. They did 2. Brad Sigmund and another man. Brad Sigmund had killed family members, and the shot to his heart was pretty much right on target, right on his heart. Excuse me. But the other man had murdered a police officer. And the shots that hit him were way far away from the heart. This is a quote, a trauma surgeon who evaluated the autopsy results. And you can hear him talk about this and see the video with him on the front page of our webpage. And then he also evaluated the last Utah firing squad. Same thing. That was a man named Ronnie Lee Gardner, and his brother, somebody that works with us a lot, Randy Gardner, who actually petitioned to receive a copy of the autopsy. It took him 6 years. But then for the last 9 years, he's had these autopsy pictures, which are brutal, and the autopsy results, the findings of the medical examiner, but he never really had them interpreted. So he was there when we did a press conference by Zoom to have the doctor evaluate this, which he did. And he had not realized that they had deliberately shot off center. The grouping of the bullets was relatively close together, all to the side. None of them hit his heart. They all hit other vital organs. So he bled out and died after about 2 minutes. Same thing with the man in South Carolina. But if you're hit in the heart, one bullet in the heart, and you should be dead within seconds. And that is not what happened to him. So we created a campaign to say, if you're going to do it, shoot straight. And we actually raised some money and bought billboards in Utah. And we made handheld signs, that sort of thing. And I can show you, let's see, we just changed up the message. Let's see if I'm able, yeah. So share this. This is why we changed one of the messages to, this is a live billboard that's up somewhere in Utah right now. And I wonder if I can change. Looks like I need to stop this, and I'll point to another one. This is the other billboard that we had up now. Why is it showing that? There we are. So Utah does not need execution. So these 2 messages are what we have up right now. And prior to today, the one that says "Thou shalt not kill" said again, if you're going to do it, shoot straight. With the idea being that we can then begin the conversation that there's a problem with the firing squad, and you need to make sure that the firing squad understands that they need to shoot straight and hit the person. If you're going to do it, no torture, no creating additional pain. And we know we got their attention. The Salt Lake Tribune is writing an article about it. They actually published it for about 15 minutes on Saturday. I was able to grab it before they took it back down. And we were told by the reporter today that they took it down because they hadn't planned for it to go live until they got photos of one of the billboards. And part of the problem is that the reason that the way we bought the billboards, and this was a good lesson learned, is we bought them from a broker who, what they do is they will find empty space on those electric billboards and then plug in our image. So we're supposed to get 25,000 impressions per day for 10 days, but it's on random billboards and we can't predict where they're going to be. They're just in Utah somewhere. So if we can get the news coverage, if the story is printed, that's going to carry the message further. And we've already had some news coverage of our activities. And, I'm both grateful and glad that the execution is not happening. But of course, that totally dashes media coverage on this issue because it's a non-issue now. So we're still running the billboards because we paid for them and we can't get out of the contract. But we are, we will be, we're hoping and working to get media coverage. And of course, we'll be sharing out what's happening. And we're going to get a report soon to find out where in Utah those billboards have actually shown. But the good news is that that we know people are seeing this message, and that's the point.
Yeah, we shared something similar. I made just a little thing that Maria put up for again, like, why are you not hitting the heart? That's such a important question. And obviously I saw the in the Supreme Court case that allowed for there to be firing squads. Again, they said, well, if you hit the heart, it's 15 seconds. It's not, cruel and unusual punishment, all these things. But of course, if you're shooting to the side intentionally or seemingly intentionally, that all goes out the window. And that argument is,
well, exactly. But I'll be clear. For us, it's not about how we kill our prisoners.
Right.
It's that we allow states to execute people when the system is so broken, and truly the suffering and the torture of the death penalty is in the weight. Mm-hmm. Much more than, yes, it can be excruciating to be suffocated to death or drowned to death, which is essentially what waterboarding is, or shot and have to bleed out, or that's really what they're using right now is firing squad, gas suffocation, lethal injection, or in some states you can pick the electric chair. I think that's probably the most guaranteed immediate bam hit and you're out, theoretically, because we don't actually know what a person is going through in that minute or 2 minutes of electrocution. We do know that when people are getting gas suffocation, as they do in Alabama and Louisiana right now, that there is real, the terror of oxygen deprivation and of not being able to get your breath is very real. And it can actually be seen and has been seen by the people who've witnessed those gas suffocation executions. The thing about lethal injection is that it's a little bit different because you're essentially theoretically putting a prisoner to sleep before you're killing them. And it all depends on which drugs they're using. But in some states, they use something called midazolam, which I've had midazolam that's used in hospitals all the time. But it has a ceiling effect in how much sedation you can pump in all of that you want. You only only get to a certain level of sedation. And what we've seen, since we can no longer get sodium thiopental, which was the first drug that they used to use until companies stopped selling that, is that it's unclear just how unconscious a person is. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the autopsies, the people that have been killed using midazolam, and also I think pentobarbital, their death is pulmonary edema, their lungs filling up with fluid. So they're essentially drowning to death. And the question is, how conscious are they to that? And we can see because they're no longer paralyzing somebody before they kill them. We can see the struggling, the coughing, the wheezing, the straining against the restraints. So those are things that are happening, that are being done. The prison workers are taking on the trauma of doing that to people. But again, it boils back down to we're executing people after they've been waiting 20, 30, sometimes the guy we killed in Florida last week, 42 years. Ralph Menzies in Utah, 39 years since the crime. That's a very long time. And death row is no picnic, no matter how you look at it.
Yeah. It's also very hard, I'm sure, for the families having this hanging over their head for 39, 40 years. Whereas if you have a situation where someone has been sentenced to, say, life in prison, you can kind of move on from, that aspect of your life. He's away, he's in prison, he's gone, it's done. But if there's an execution pending for all of these years, you're sort of having to relive it again and again, because there's all of the evaluations, the trials, the delays, and then it finally happens. And a lot of times families are very conflicted about if they even want this. I know recently in Florida, it was a situation where the victims of the crime were actually related to the man who was on death row. And they said, we've forgiven him. We don't want him to be executed. This is just causing more trauma to our family. But no one cared. The state didn't care. They just continued on with the execution, regardless of how the families feel at that point.
They spent their time trying to find family members of the victims who would support the execution, who they would then allow to witness the execution. Truly, it's a blessing in disguise, or just a true blessing, if you don't have a death sentence of the perpetrator in your loved one's case, because there's always going to be that empty chair at the table. There's no amount of killing that's going to bring our loved ones back. But if you're told, wait till we kill the guy and then you'll feel better, and your wait is decades long, that really curtails the healing process. And it tells you you're not done. You didn't get your justice, just as you were pointing out. And what we've seen, and what I try to point out as often as I can, is the vast majority of people who commit murder, who are caught, who are eligible for the death penalty, which is not all murders, the vast majority of those who are death eligible still don't get a death sentence. And if they do, about half of all death sentences were overturned during the appeals process. So it boils down to fewer than 2% of the people that could get executed actually staying on death row to the point of execution. And if the death penalty is what we have for victim families, then what we're saying to the vast majority of them is your loved one wasn't valuable enough. When in fact, those people are getting at least the finality of, okay, assuming they caught somebody and they can convict them and they're actually guilty, then those people are getting a finality of knowing, okay, that sentence is death by incarceration. I don't have to worry about it. In a way, in some states, they still have to worry about it, but it's unlikely that they'll get freed. But there's a process, especially if the offender was a juvenile offender, juvenile at the time of the crime, which is bothersome for some people. But ultimately, what we know is that in the vast majority of cases where the death penalty is possible, they're not getting a death sentence. So what are those victim families getting? And that's something that we try to point out. We organize around that whole concept of what are the services available to victim families, how are they delivered, are they consistently and equitably delivered, are those the things that people actually need? And I can tell you that when victim families rank their needs in the aftermath of a murder of a loved one, vengeance is pretty low on the list, if it's there at all.
Yeah. And I think I just recently wrote an article about this for Rehumanize. My cousin was murdered about a decade ago. And it was exactly about how having the death penalty as an option, but not for your drug addicted cousin who we don't really value that much, is a very strange thing to say to families, where if he had been an upstanding member of society that, the mayor of a town, then yes, we want, that's, we're going to put him to death. But if you're, as my cousin was, someone who was involved in drugs and in, Native American and all these things, like, well, we don't really care all that much about prosecuting his murder. And it really, like, very clearly the state did not care. And they gave my aunt and uncle the wrong ashes. It was a mess. So there's,
Oh my gosh, that's awful.
yeah, I could go into how terrible that was prosecuted, but it was very clear that there are this like tiered victims under the current system of, justice that we have, where um families feel that, right? And of course, like, and I said in the article, there's going to be differences in sentencing guidelines. That's just, the reality of our justice system. But having it be where there is literally death, the state is going to kill the person who killed your family member versus, we can make a deal. It's, manslaughter, plea bargain type thing. It's very disorienting and, disappointing. So
Yeah.
it's,
Well,
for victims' families are not really the primary, I think, consideration in these situations. It's more at least in my opinion, it's more the general public's need for vengeance, right? The general public saying, we got this cop killer or something like that, that they're really aiming towards.
that's right. Although I will say that if you look at victim families and who the victims are, I should say, in these cases, 80%, approximately 80% of all the people that have been executed in the United States since 1977 have been executed for the murder of white people. Even though people of color are the victims of murder and violent crime more than half the time. In some states, like I live in Ohio, about 66% of murder victims are people of color. And this year, up until this execution the other day in Florida last week, and one other, I mean, we've had now, I think, 29 executions this year. And in either 26 or 7 of them, the victims were all white. We raised this issue in Florida around a previous case, and then Governor DeSantis went looking for somebody who killed Black victims, and that's who they executed last week. And since he had 3 Black victims, that upped the numbers even better. Turning it around, there's a guy named Juan Melendez, who did 17 years, 8 months, and 1 day on Florida's death row. Got out while I was still the director of Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. So 2003 or 4, somewhere in there. I left Florida in 2005. But Juan at some point gave me his prison ID because I kept remarking on it. It made him so furious because Juan was Puerto Rican, so Hispanic. And the way the census works is you're not Hispanic, you're Hispanic white or Hispanic Black, right? And Juan was noted on his prison ID as Hispanic white. To look at him, he's as dark as a Puerto Rican comes if he weren't Black, right? But a pretty dark skinned man. And, so he just was furious that they counted him as white. But that turns out to be how they skew the numbers, because they can indicate that Hispanics are white. So when they say more than half of the people on death row are white, you have to then carve that up and say, okay, really? Are you Hispanic white or Hispanic Black? And how many of those people are there? I always check other when I'm asked to identify my race because I'm Jewish. And, that's its own race. And it doesn't matter what your skin color is or what your national orientation is. If you're Jewish, the Nazis still want to kill you. They don't care what you look like.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that I was thinking about a minute ago, so it's kind of going back, but I wanted to tell you I had an interesting conversation with someone, and I'm sure you run into this a lot, where we shared about the firing squad executions, and someone's response was, we don't do firing squad executions in this country anymore. What are you talking about? That hasn't been done for decades. So
twice this year.
completely unaware about like how these modern, I say modern in that they are currently happening, but how executions are being performed right now. It's just people don't know. People are unaware of this.
Gas suffocation in Louisiana and Alabama and Tennessee. You can choose between electric chair and lethal injection. In South Carolina, you choose between firing squad, electric chair, or lethal injection. In Florida, it's straight up lethal injection. In Texas, it's straight up lethal injection. In Oklahoma, it's straight up lethal injection, although they do have the backup of firing squad and gas suffocation, but Oklahoma's got plenty of drugs. Idaho just this year made their primary method of execution a firing squad. They haven't done one yet, but now they've made it so that the prisoner doesn't get to choose. And this is important in Idaho because they've had two people with death warrants. One who was almost executed. They had him on the table, poking him. They couldn't get the IV going. So they had to give up and send him back to his cell. And that's happened in more than one occasion in the last few years. That's why Alabama moved to gas, because they had two people in a row that they sent back to their cells after trying to kill them. Anyway, Idaho has now made that the primary method. And now it turns out that they're looking at a way to automate it so that humans are not involved in pulling the trigger directly. I mean, somebody's going to have to push that button somehow. But that's the Idaho Statesman just had an article about that this morning. And, you know, it's the mechanism that worries people and not the fact that carved into the face of the US Supreme Court building are the words equal justice under law. And if that's the bedrock foundation of our legal system, and anybody that's ever encountered the legal system, judicial or civil, criminal or civil, understands that it's not about anything other than how much money you have going into the courtroom, how much money, what kind of attorneys you can buy, what kind of justice you can buy, sometimes what kind of judge you can buy. You know, because at the end of the day, the judge and the prosecutor and the defense attorney are all riding the same elevator in the back room, figuring out where they're going to play golf the next weekend.
Yeah, I mean, and there's been cases where juries have said we don't want the death penalty, and then judges have come in and said actually we are going to execute, this person. And
that's right. Jury override is very real, and it's happening. And also now in Florida, you can be sentenced to death with a non-unanimous jury, and that you need a vote of 8 to at least 8 people in favor. And actually, one of the people recently executed in Florida, and it's hard to keep track of them all because they've got dozens of people that are eligible for a death warrant. And they're now keeping, basically 2 people on death watch at a time. So every time they execute somebody, they set a new date. So they executed somebody on Thursday, they set a new date on Friday. So we have 2 people facing execution in Florida right now. One is going to be killed on the 17th of September, and the next on the 30th of September. And when they have that execution on the 17th, if they haven't already set a third person to death watch, they're going to, because for some reason, that's what Governor DeSantis is all about.
Yeah, I read something, and I don't know where, I can't remember where I read it. So I don't know the complete validity, but they were basically saying that how Florida is operating right now is they literally are moving detainees from cell to cell, like on the list that they're on. So there's like this additional kind of psychological torture of you're literally like marching towards death as you are getting closer to having your death warrant, executed, because they clear one out and then they're, moving the next person in. And but even if that isn't what is happening exactly logistically, to hear that they are just so quickly putting things on and making this like the streamlined process right now under DeSantis, which for so long had been something where executions would take place maybe once or twice a year, and now they're just going. I don't know. It really points to, though, how important the governor is towards this whole process, because here in Louisiana, we had John Bel Edwards for 8 years, so there were no executions at all. But now that we are back under a Republican governor who is in favor of the death penalty, they've started up again. So,
and it does depend. In some states, the governor has a say in terms of setting dates or granting clemency. In other states, they can't grant clemency without a recommendation of the parole board. And in Utah, for example, Governor Cox there has no say whether the execution happens or not. It's all up to the parole board. And if they deny parole, it's either the courts or the parole board. But who appoints people to the parole board? That's the governor. Normally, every state may be a little bit different, but ultimately, what you're talking about is it's a political process. And in the states where we've abolished the death penalty, it hasn't hurt the people who expended political capital to do that. In all but one case, only one legislator of all those states that have legislatively abolished death penalty, meaning the legislature voted to pass the bill and then the governor signed the bill. So that's New Jersey, New Mexico, Illinois, Connecticut, Maryland, Nebraska, New Hampshire, Colorado, Virginia, Washington, and Delaware. Now in Washington and Delaware, the courts do it out, and then they pass laws to scrub it out of the statute. But only in Connecticut, they passed the bill, and the governor vetoed it, and then there was a horrible crime in the district of somebody who had voted to pass the bill. So she was challenged in the next election and elected out because of this horrible crime that happened in her district. Then she was elected to Congress. So it really didn't hurt her politically. And that person that challenged her ended up losing in his attempt for re-election. So, it was just a one-time thing. But that's the only person that has had the death penalty, their vote to abolish the death penalty used against them in a subsequent election. So we tell people that as much as we can. You're not, when they have a vote in a legislature, we always try to make it a conscience vote so that people can vote where they are and not have to be beholden to their caucus, their political caucus, the Democrat or Republican or whatever it may be. And when that happens, that's how we win, because there may be people that are Republican and conservative, but they're also pro-life consistently. Or they have a deep concern about fairness in the system. But it tends to be people that are voting their religion, and their religion is opposed to the death penalty. So Catholics in particular.
Yeah, that was the case with John Bonowitz. I mean, he was a Democrat, but very Catholic. And so that was, I'm sure, played a big role into it. And
well, that's why we're hoping that will help in one of the upcoming cases. Lance Shockley has a real strong innocence claim in Missouri, and this will be the new governor of Missouri's first execution. And, we're really pouring on pressure from Catholics to him directly to say, you don't need to do this. And the real challenge is, number one, he's a bit of a MAGA guy. So, MAGA people want to kowtow to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is all about the death penalty. And so that's a potential challenge with him. But also it's the first execution on his watch. And, that's sort of, you have to get that under your belt so that you can prove that you're tough on crime. And so we're going to see what happens, because the challenge really is that Lance Shockley has been denied DNA testing that could show, somehow challenge his conviction. I don't know the specifics of what they want to test or how it will do that, but they want to test it. And why not? And they're saying no. And that's one of the things that people should be aware of. And we've all heard about a lot more about due process because of what's happening with refugees and asylum seekers and people that are undocumented in the United States, having no due process, being, deported without even being able to go in front of a judge, or, all the things that they're doing there, right? We don't have to get into all that. But we've heard about this, and the problem with due process with death penalty cases is that once you're so far along in the appeals process, or if you've already had an appeal on one certain thing and new evidence comes up, you're not automatically guaranteed the right to bring that new evidence or a new perspective. They're going to kill a guy named Robert Robertson. in Texas in October. He was almost executed last year in Texas. In fact, the only reason he's alive is because the Texas the House Committee on Criminal Justice Reform, I think is what it's called. They were examining the implementation of a law that says if the science used to convict you changes, you get a fresh look based on the current interpretation of the science. And that should have stopped his conviction. It should have brought his conviction into question. And instead, they wanted to go ahead with the execution. Well, these legislators very wisely could not get relief. He could not get relief in the criminal courts. So the legislators sued the Department of Corrections and the Attorney General to stop the execution based on, we want him to testify at our hearing on Monday, and he can't do that if you kill him on the previous Thursday. And,
Nice.
and they did that in the Texas Supreme Court, which normally doesn't do criminal cases. That's the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. It's the top court in Texas. And that stopped the execution.
Interesting.
Now they say they've got more evidence. They want to put it on, but the courts have so far not allowed that to come forward. And it's in all likelihood, he will be procedurally barred. Now, unless they're able to raise enough public pressure that somehow gets them to want to not go through with that execution until they look at all the evidence. We're going to see what happens. But I can tell you in 2023 in Texas, there was Arthur Brown was executed. They came up with evidence that really cast doubt on his conviction, but they only got the evidence a month before he was executed, and it was procedurally barred. There was another man who was executed. They came up with evidence that his jury foreperson, was using outwardly racist language about him in deliberations and in the jury room. And that should have thrown out his death sentence, not necessarily his conviction, but his death sentence, and gotten him a new and fair death sentence with an unbiased jury. But again, procedurally barred. It's too late to raise that issue. So therefore, we don't care. That's the problem that's happening across the country right now that people should be concerned about. There's so much more we could talk about, but
yes. Okay. Well, let me just move it to now, because we're talking about like how people can get involved in that sort of thing. I know y'all are doing a sort of a social media pitch and also a redesign for some of your signs and banners. I don't know if that's still going on.
Well, we're having a T-shirt design contest. Looking for ways to create some new look. We'll see if anybody can come up with something creative. I'm a big fan of very big, bold language, like stop executions now, and just put it in words, because that's just me. But anyway, we're putting that. So there's that. We have a social media team. We have a fundraising team that people can get on and support the work. We're happy if you just go and sign the petitions and share them on your social media, whatever channels you happen to be on, to engage people more in understanding that executions are happening and that they're problematic. Every single one of them has problems with fairness, or there's an issue. The next guy scheduled to be killed in Texas, for example, no argument about his intellectual disability. And that appears to be the case also with the next man to be killed in Florida. Everybody agrees, intellectually disabled, but not enough quite to make the measure. And part of that is because when the US Supreme Court disallowed the execution of people with intellectual disability, they didn't set a way to measure that. They didn't set a number. It's commonly thought that, anywhere in the range of 70 to 72 and below is intellectually disabled in terms of their IQ. And yet we're executing people with IQs in the 60s, and so all of these things are issues that come up. The other thing that comes up regularly in terms of helping us understand who we're executing, the common thread through almost everybody that's being executed is abuse, neglect, and addiction at childhood. either the person who ends up being a killer or the people in their family. So they're in a very abusive, dysfunctional family situation. That doesn't excuse their crimes, but it helps us mitigate them, to understand, okay, what led a person down this path and made them think, get on a path to where they might commit murder. And what if we were to intervene in the lives of people before they commit murder, when we can see those kinds of behaviors? And it didn't happen in the cases of the people that end up on death row.
Mhm. And I'll also just add to that, and then I'll open up for questions, is that in some states, you don't even have to be the one who did commit murder, right? They have the felony murder charges where if you were just adjacent, and there have been some cases where the person who actually killed someone didn't get the death penalty, but then someone who was just an accessory who was there, they did, because they were tried separately, and that's how things.
Blaine Milam in Texas, that intellectually disabled person I was talking about, he makes that claim. He was not the actual killer, somebody else was. We killed Emmanuel Littlejohn when, all the witnesses said it was the taller, darker guy, and he was the shorter, lighter skinned guy. And yet the guy that everybody said was actually the killer, he got, they were tried by separate juries. And the prosecution in both separate trials said this is the shooter for each of them. And so he got a death sentence and was executed. It's not entirely innocent. It's called the law of parties. You're present to the crime, you were there or a party to it somehow, but you're not the trigger person. You're not the person that did the actual killing. And you're right. It's often the one who gets the best deal is the one who turns state's evidence first against the others, and everybody else is screwed.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And going back to my cousin's murder, that's why he served very little time in prison, is because he turned against the drug dealers whose ranch everything took place on, and that mattered a lot more than, murder of someone involved. So yeah, it is often about larger goals rather than a specific case when it comes to prosecutions, I've learned. All right, so opening the floor up to questions. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? You can just go ahead and come off mute if you do. I know Brian was asking earlier about the firing squad, and if that was something that was common to happen, but I kind of explained a little bit about how it's more difficult to get the drugs that had been used for executions now. But can you explain a little bit about that? Because they're not manufactured anymore. The drugs that we had been using to do lethal injections are no longer available. So it's only states that still have some in stock, or how is that process working?
So the drug that's no longer available is still available in Europe. You can get it there. It's just illegal to export it to the United States, because here, if it's again used in hospitals all the time, anesthesiologists are still disappointed that drug is no longer available to us here. That's sodium thiopental, and that's used for fast-acting sedation and that sort of thing. So they can't use that anymore. So they're using, in some states where they're using a several drug protocol, is midazolam is the first one to get you unconscious, and then they'll use another drug to stop your heart or to stop your breathing, or sometimes two other drugs. A lot of states have moved to something called pentobarbital, which I've helped two dogs on their way across the Rainbow Bridge, if you will, when it was their time. Both of them died in my arms very quickly using pentobarbital. Doesn't work quite the same way on people, but that is readily available at your veterinarian's office right now because they use it every day. And yet, pharmaceutical companies that are making these drugs for the purpose of saving lives don't want their drugs used for killing. So states have spent a lot of money. When I euthanized a dog the last time at the vet's office, I think the bill was like $400. There are states that are spending $200,000 for a dose. Okay, because that's what you pay when you want that drug, and the only people that will sell it to you are people that shouldn't be selling it. There is incidents where they're actually going down and paying cash, bags of cash in a parking lot at Walmart. Arkansas did that a long time ago, but so people say, well, we got plenty of fentanyl in the evidence lockers, and why aren't we using that? And I think that there's just I would agree. Why aren't we using that if we have it? But that's not it's not seen as ethical.
All right, there's a couple questions in the comments there. I'll let you look at, Abe.
Let's see here. Hi, Tony. How effective do you think it is to use a consistency argument when communicating with an official who's pro-life on abortion to plead a prisoner is scheduled for execution? Could it ever sway them? Or are they too far gone as their opinions and executions? I think that it depends. I mean, Ohio has a governor, Governor Mike DeWine, who, as Attorney General, did everything he could to move cases along. Once he became the governor, he put on a governor hat, and he has been consistently pro-life ever since. We have more than 30 people with execution dates, and he keeps reprieving them, pushing them down to the end of the line instead of carrying out executions. And I think for someone like him, the consistent life ethic argument is his own. He's making it. He's deciding that's how he's going to be. Others will, of course, be dismissive and say, well, we're talking about innocent life, right? So that's where babies are, until they're born, they're innocent. And then as soon as they're born, then let's let them grow up and then we can execute them. That's part of what's happening. So I don't know. I think every single legislator is different. And really the most important thing is to start having meetings with them and hear what they say, and then chip away at that. There was a case, so I was the field manager in New Jersey, which was the first state to legislatively abolish the death penalty in the current era. We were meeting with one legislator who shared with us his son had been killed by a drunk driver, and he wanted that person to suffer as much as possible. And that's obviously not a capital case. But we had Kirk Bloodsworth go visit him. Kirk Bloodsworth was on death row in Maryland for a crime he did not commit. He's the first person that was exonerated and freed using DNA technology. And Kirk, in his book and in his remarks, when he's speaking, talks about how he thinks life in prison is worse, that incarceration in maximum security prison is awful and dangerous and uncomfortable and therefore worse, that prison execution is a release. So he went and met with that legislator and left him a copy of his book, and the legislator read the book and came to understand that death by incarceration, throwing away the key, is worse than death. So that's what he wanted, and that's how we got his vote. It's not the most honorable way to get a vote, but it helped that legislator move on his position on the death penalty. His motivation is he wanted them to suffer more, and he came to realize that dying in prison is more suffering than being executed. Being executed is kind of a release in a way. And that's just because we listened to the man and heard what his motivations were, and then found a way to make that argument for him. And that's the key to winning or finding common ground with anybody you're on the opposite side with, is listen to each other and then dialogue in a way that you might be heard and help them see maybe it's a win-win for both of us, depending on how we look at it. And I will immediately concede, this is not an easy discussion to have. Many people among us are prison abolitionists that don't believe there should be prisons at all. I'm not one of those people. There are people who, as they presently exist, should never be free. And certainly people who've committed horrible crimes. regardless of motivation or background, if you've done that, if you've picked up a gun and shot people, then we get to be safe from you and you get to be held accountable and frankly punished severely. Doesn't mean torture, doesn't mean it has to be awful, but at least, in Virginia, they call it internal exile. At least you're going away. And, that's it's a hard thing to stomach sometimes, but and there's always questions about, is this exactly what needs to happen in this case? And that's the real challenge is, when they take away judicial discretion so the judges can, vary sentencing based on all of the factors around a person who's committed a crime, that creates bad situations too.
And I think the last question here from Alex is, resource would you recommend for people to get more informed about what's happening about the death penalty? Because he says, I knew more than most people about this, but even some of what you're saying today is shocking to someone who knows about the death penalty. So what are some resources that we can send people to just kind of let them know what's happening?
Well, if you want the facts and figures, the best source for that is the Death Penalty Information Center, deathpenaltyinfo.org. We're deathpenaltyaction.org. We're not partner organizations or anything like that. We exist in the same space, but that's how you remember it. Info.org, deathpenaltyinfo.org is how you get to that webpage. I think that part of, there's a lot of books out there, and we're in the midst of putting together a book list. There's books, there's movies, there's blogs, there's Substacks. But really, actually, I would say start coming to our virtual vigils, because each time, and just start reading the petitions. Sometimes the petitions are put up with all the information that we have, and it's not very much. But once we get to them and fill in all the details and get the official case narratives, then there's often links to studies, links to more information, so you can learn on a case-by-case basis as you go. Plus, we do a live virtual vigil for every execution. And normally in one of those, we try our best to have somebody who knows the prisoner, share a little bit about them, but also normally there'll be a legal expert. Often it's Rob Dunham, who's the director of the Death Penalty Policy Project, another entity. He's got a Substack. He used to be the director of the Death Penalty Information Center. And then when he wanted to be able to speak more politically, more about the politics of things, shifted over to this other space. But he'll often come on and talk about the specific case, but then frame it within the bigger picture. And so much of what you'll hear are, talking about the current legal situations that allow this injustice to go forward. So there's that. I would just go back to, there's some books that you definitely could read. And it's just whatever direction you want to go in. There's one that I always recommend, and I'm blanking on the name of it, but it's going to come to me, and maybe we can send it out, or we can send out this book list. New stuff is coming out all the time. So stay present to the executions that are coming up, and look at the recent executions and the information in the petitions in particular. So for example, if you go to the petition on our webpage for Blaine Milam, you'll find links to, I think there's a link to an amicus brief. So an amicus brief is a friend of the court brief from the Association for Retarded Citizens, ARC, and NAMI, the National Association on Mental Illness, that get into the details of these issues. So it's just looking at some of the filings and looking at some of those things if you really want to do a deep dive. But stay present about what's happening with the executions and the petitions, and come to the virtual vigils, and you'll get the full spectrum over a period of time. I've been doing this for over 35 years now, and that's how all this stuff kind of rolls off the tip of my tongue, because it's just something I live with. I don't encourage that, but it's also all of it comes from being present to what is happening in these executions and aware of what's allowed to happen. Yeah, you're muted, Lauren. Lauren, you're muted.
I was just responding to, I think that ARC is now one of those organizations that no longer actually stands for what, like they don't say they're retarded citizens. It's now just ARC of, she was just saying that has, become.
Thank you for clarifying that.
I would just, but I'm sure there's several of those organizations where their original framing now is kind of, whatever words that they were using have fallen out of use, and so now they just have kind of like the standing for itself. But I was just clarifying that point. But I think that, yeah, all of those are great resources, and I would love if you could, Abe, just if you want to send me an email that has some of those listed out, and then I can get something formatted so that we can send out to our whole email list about if you want to know more about this, and just kind of do a deep dive into what's happening with the issue, and how people can get more involved, because that's sort of something we did with the when we did the vigil to abolish the nuclear danger. We had sort of an educational email that we sent out, and I think something like that would be really, really useful for this, because it is such a big issue. Like you said, I know you have worked in it in so long, and so it kind of rolls off the tongue, but it's so complicated because there's so many states that are doing things differently in each state, and it's hard to keep track of. And like you said too, internationally as well, the information that you're posting about Iran in particular was horrible and eye-opening to how frequently people are being executed over there. So I think we'd love to put something together with that. And then
let me just say first, yeah. Nicole, thank you. There's Nicole in the chat and the audiences has been guiding us on some of the language issues, particularly around people with mental health issues. So we appreciate that, and we're trying to do better. So thank you. I will say, if you go to our webpage at deathpenaltyaction.org, all the way at the bottom, there is something called The People versus the Death Penalty. It's a video, a collection of 8 videos that we made. We'd love to make more. They cost about $5,000 a piece. So, we need that money to do it better. But each of those, you got a former executioner, a victim family member, a couple of people who are exonerated and freed, a couple of family members of people on death row, and also a human rights professor. And if you could watch each of those, they're only about 5 minutes long, each of them, and learn a lot. They're only in the voices of the people that are being interviewed. And so it's all perspective in some ways, but also really, really important to we try to center the impacted communities, the people that are suffering through this directly. And those are the voices you want to be hearing.
Absolutely. And again, in this issue, it impacts so many people beyond just the immediate person who is facing execution, but there are so many lives touched. And I'll end it on this. I have a neighbor who teaches my son chess, and he was actually he's a retired mortician. So he, worked very closely with death his whole life. And he got involved in a men's group. I live in Louisiana, out at Angola. They have a men's group where they minister to the prisoners out there. And they started the executions again in Louisiana. And so he messaged the chess group and said, I'm going to protest, this thing. And I was like, oh, I didn't know you were involved in that movement, Brother Pete, that's interesting. And he goes, well, he's my friend. They're trying to kill my friend. He had worked with him in this prison ministry for years and years. And
I was out at that execution.
So. Were you? Okay, interesting. So yeah, you might have seen him. He was probably wearing a big red shirt. That's what Mr. Pete usually wears. So we'll have to see. But I mean, the lives that are touched by people, even who have done terrible things, that led to that place, their lives still have meaning and value. And that's what we're trying to stay at Rehumanize, is that, all human life has value and worth, and that they should have a life free of aggressive violence. So I appreciate very much all that you do to that end, Abe, and that all that you're doing. Again, let me know anything that you have upcoming, anything that we can help you with, and I'll try to put something together to send out for just more resources and more help, because it's a big job, especially right now.
Yeah, well, we will get you that. And, we've got, I think we've had 29 or 30 executions this year. It's hard to keep track. We're on track to have the most executions in the country since 2013 or 12, depending on how many we get. And there's a lot to stay focused on. But I invite you all, come to our webpage, sign the petitions, look at the opportunities for action, share it around, let people know. And if there's any questions I can answer, just write to us, info@deathpenaltyaction.org. If I don't get back to you, Ali or Trish will with the answers. And I also hope to see you all at the conference Halloween weekend in
Yes.
so
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're very excited about that. And everyone on the call, we would love to see you guys there. And yeah, keep doing all this work. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and end the call, and I really appreciate it. If you have any other questions for me personally too, you can email at either info@rehumanize.intl.org or exec direct no T at rehumanize.intl.org. Thank you so much, y'all.
thank you.